Hi, this is Susie and welcome to episode number 3 of the Luke Experiment podcast. In each of these episodes, I've been sitting down with a group of students who've brought different perspectives to our discussion of the Luke Experiment. This is a reaction podcast, so if you haven't listened to part 3 of the Luke Experiment, I really recommend you go check it out. This will make a whole lot more sense if you have. The Luke Experiment was made by a group of students reading out the Gospel of Luke, which is a first century account of the life of Jesus, and you can find it at storycambridge.uk. In this episode of the podcast, I was joined by Dan and his friends James and Jamila, and I had so much fun chatting with these guys. I really hope you enjoy it too. Here it is. Thanks so much, guys, for coming. It's a real pleasure to see you on Zoom and to chat to you. We've got Dan, we've got James, we've got Jamila. Why don't you all introduce yourselves in that lovely alphabetical order that I've just said? Dan, who are you?
I am Dan Chapman. I am a third year engineering student from Homerton. I am vaguely involved with the Luke Experiment, which is why I am here. I was a couple of voices. You heard my voice in the introduction. And yeah, I've been kind of running the whole project along with other story bits and pieces. These are my friends, the wonderful James and Jamila.
Are we? Yes, no, of course. Yeah, I'm James, also third year at Homerton, friend of Dan, of course. And I'm interested to have a bit of a discussion about all the Luke Experiment stuff today.
Hi, I'm Jamila. I'm a third year natural scientist, also at Homerton. And I chat with Dan quite a lot in our free time about his faith, so I'm quite excited to talk about it in a more formal, possibly more intellectual context.
That's so exciting.
I'm not very intellectual most of the time. Yeah.
Oh, I'm really excited to hear all of your thoughts. James, did you say what you study?
Oh, no, I didn't. I'm studying medicine. I'm in third year, so I'm doing psychology.
We're a STEM bunch.
You are a scientific trio.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they call us.
Wow. Yeah, catchy. So, Dan, why don't we just come to you first of all? You have been pretty much masterminding this whole Luke Experiment, and as you said, you read a few lines as part of this particular episode that we're going to be chatting about today. I'd love to hear from you what your experience was like. You've obviously read, as part of doing this, you've read Luke quite extensively. Has it taught you anything new? Have you been surprised by anything as you've gone through that process?
I mean, yeah, for anyone who's been to church a bit, usually you'd have a relatively small chunk that, you'd have a sermon about or that kind of thing. And you only really get the experience, by yourself if you're reading the whole thing. Even if it's like a sermon series going through Luke over the course of many weeks, you don't really get a feel for the plot or just how some themes at the beginning, and it's just like a callback to earlier and how themes develop towards the end. So you just get, a way more holistic view, and it just kind of changes how you look at Jesus, because particularly for Luke's gospel, it's got this momentum of I'm going to Jerusalem to die, which you just miss if you just have parables in abstract. But yeah.
Fun. And you guys, James and Jamila, how about for you? Have you read this before? Is it new to you? Tell me about that.
I think at school we read some of the parables and stuff, but I've not read it in its entirety. And to be fair, I've still only read this section that we're listening to today, so I'm still not entirely completely informed. But I've got a loosely based idea of what's going on. Jamila.
Well, I've never been to a Christian school, so I haven't learnt about any of the Bible at school. But, funnily enough, I am actually familiar with the few of the events that were discussed in, this, section of Luke. But I think that was just luck of the draw that I was
Yeah, no, I
familiar
recognise
with
a few bits as well. The 2 fish, 5 loaves of bread, classic.
Yeah, the
classic.
stories get around, don't they?
Yeah.
So
You'd hope.
yeah. So some of it was familiar to you guys, but was there anything that stood out to either of you as like, oh, that's surprising?
I think one of the main bits I hadn't heard of was when Jesus went up to the mountain and saw the prophets of old. But that was pretty much the only passage that I wasn't entirely familiar with, but I didn't know the exact phrasing or what was going on with the passages, so that was very new thinking about how Jesus was responding to certain situations and when he would be keen to share to the people and when he wanted to be very private. That was something that was new to me.
Did you notice anything about that? About how sometimes Jesus wanted to teach and sometimes he wanted to go and often be by himself? I don't know, does that tell you anything new about the person of Jesus that you hadn't thought before?
Well, I think it's a little difficult for me to say because I don't quite understand Jesus's motivations in every situation because I'm not familiar with all the things that he does. In a way, sometimes it made him seem more human rather than just being the son of God, which is how I thought, and how he is flawed, and in a way when he did almost seem tired and kind of frustrated with the people, the humans that he was among. But then other times, like during the period where he didn't let the rabbi tell the people how his daughter had been resurrected, at those points I did not understand why he was doing the things he was doing.
Yeah, it's a really curious thing, isn't it, that Jesus quite often seems to tell people not to tell others about who he is and what he's done. And it's surprising that. Do either of you guys have any thoughts about why that might be? Why would Jesus, who's meant to be the Son of God and announcing this kingdom of God that's going to be coming, why might he tell people not to spread the word about him?
Okay, I got the all clear from James. It's one of those things that you kind of notice in the arc, again, if you do the whole thing, because it's like towards the beginning, he's much more hush-hush. And towards the end, particularly around like Easter week, where he comes to Jerusalem, like riding on a donkey, like every day he's in the temple teaching and healing people, like very much the end of his ministry where he gets killed and so on like that. It's like, that's when he's doing everything publicly. And it's funny that Jesus is kind of like this ninja most of the time, just dodging crowds. He doesn't go into like populated areas very much, or if he does, he has a little hit and run. Because it's just, he goes through all the towns and villages because like such crowds gather to him. And I get the expectation was always that the Messiah was going to like kill all the Romans. And so if Jesus is going to dodge that and not, want to be this military leader that everyone wants him to be, he takes many steps to avoid it. So it's only at like the opportune moment that everything clicks together that, after the resurrection is when the disciples are like, oh, when Jesus said that thing? Yeah, it makes sense. They're just like, no one really knows what's going on at the time. And it all kind of comes to a head, in like Easter with the cross and the resurrection. And then it makes sense to people afterwards. That's generally the pattern as you go through. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so.
I'm looking at some blank face.
What you're saying there, Dan, is really helpful. It's good to take a big range view of what's being said in Luke's gospel to see the broad narrative that he's telling of Jesus' life. But also that as we're reading this book of Luke, we're reading it as an isolated document, but it's come really quite near the end of the whole Bible. And the Bible's made up of loads of different books written by different authors, but it's also one unified story. And Jesus is coming into a people and a place that's got a long history that we can go back and read about in the Old Testament. And they were awaiting a king. They were awaiting someone who was going to be a great military leader, who was going to save them from the oppressing nations around them. In this case, at this time, that was Rome. And so, yeah, I think what you're trying to say there, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, is that Jesus knew that if he came announcing, I am the one who's going to save you and the whole world, they would think he's going to be that military leader and that they would try and make him king. So I think is that what you're saying? That's why he wouldn't say...
That's just like...
So
go on, James.
To the kind of the every person, I know that their perspectives on who he was varied, but if they didn't know that he was, the Messiah and all that, like, how did his, the way that he was forgiving people for their sins, like, how did that carry any kind of gravitas or any sort of, that it wasn't just a random bloke saying you are forgiven? Like, I don't know, that sort of perspective.
Wait, just random bloke coming around saying, like in the first story where like this woman comes and just like cries on Jesus' feet and something like that.
Yeah.
It's like, it only makes sense if people knows who Jesus is at that point. Like, so yeah, I get what you mean. It's just, oh, you're the Messiah. And Jesus does a lot to like dodge that, but he does like reveal himself to a bunch of people. I don't know, is it in Luke? Can't remember.
And why to those people?
It's so
like,
random,
what?
just like a Samaritan woman, or just like people who are just like tax collectors, or just fishermen. And he just like dodges the establishment almost all the time. And then they come knocking on the door and it's just like, oh, Jesus, why are you doing that? And it's such a common relationship where he just like says, hey, I'm the Messiah, come follow me, to just these most random people who really just don't seem to deserve it at all. And he just says, come along, and they do. That's weird.
But I just think that if he did that to more people, surely there'd be a huge number of, all the cynics would decrease hugely in numbers. I don't fully understand the kind of selective nature of.
Wait, how do you
showing
think
himself
Jesus should approach a cynic? What do you think, like, what's the ideal Jesus to do to, like, someone who's a bit quizzical?
Well, I mean, if he did a miracle, like, right in front of them, that would be fairly... I don't know. Jamila, what are your thoughts?
Well, I was going to kind of, I think, possibly disagree, because in trying to understand how Jesus is quite anti-establishment, maybe if he did mainly preach to people in positions of power who were already religious leaders and informed, they might change his word more to kind of fit the agenda of the people that they're preaching to, and because they consider themselves to be informed too, whereas just random people will perhaps interpret what Jesus is doing more literally and not put the spin of their own religion on it. So perhaps his word might be spread in the more pure way.
Fair play.
Yeah, I think it's
such
a key point that you've both brought out there, that Jesus does sometimes interact with authorities, doesn't he? And he clashes with those people sometimes and has a bit of a it feels like a heated debate with them. Whereas, why might it be that most often the people that he chooses to reveal himself to are nobodies, and the people he has really heartfelt encounters with are those that society would say are the least important? I wonder if that says anything about Jesus' character, that again might be a different spin on it, that perhaps he isn't seeking that military power, he isn't seeking that reputation, but he's seeking to be with those that no one else wants to be with. Any thoughts from any of you guys on that? Or if you disagree with what I've said as well?
Well, I mean, I'm not really, because really he doesn't seem to be like someone who wants to preach all the time, and that's, I don't know, maybe that's because he is going to save them anyway, when he dies on the cross. But it is kind of in contrast with at least the stuff I know about Dan, and I don't know about you if you are both evangelical Christians, or like where it's very important to preach the word of God, and that's one of the most important things about spreading the message. I don't really understand how Jesus himself really kind of reveals that message that you kind of take so strongly.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of trying to allude to earlier, that
why doesn't Jesus preach more? To be fair, like this part 3 doesn't have a lot of preaching in it. Like part 4 is almost entirely just Jesus speaking. So it's just like I cut part 3 literally just before. So part 4 starts with the parable of the Good Samaritan, and it's just like teaching. And so maybe I think you just got like a biased slice of like between Jesus preaching. But to be fair, he does like do a fair amount. Like there's something like the parable of the seeds and like the sower and the seeds.
Yeah.
It's like, what did you make of that? Did you just think it was a weird thing for him to start going off about, and only his disciples later say like, Jesus, what on earth did that mean? And then he explains it to them. Like, was that just a weird vibe to you? Why not just speak plainly from the beginning?
Well, I don't particularly... I was going to allude to that because I kind of understand what he's saying, that people with faith and who are loyal to God will flourish kind of under his word. But I didn't understand the point where he said he would speak plainly to his disciples, but not to other people. Why was it that the disciples got to know everything literally, especially since the disciples would be the ones who were going out and spreading his word more once Jesus had gone and, of course, writing the Bible. So they would be explaining things more literally then. It seemed like more sensible to talk about things literally in the first place while he was there, so that more people would be at least perhaps a bit more convinced or open to Christianity when works like the Bible were being written and it was being preached and established more.
I think it's a really interesting point there. And maybe a question for us all to consider is, what would we find most compelling? What do we find most convincing about a person or about a truth? Is it in a preach, in a talk, that we feel most convinced about what someone's saying? Is it in seeing their lives, like you were saying? He doesn't seem to preach that much in this section. We see a lot of what Jesus does and who he interacts with. Is it through, in that particular, we're talking about parable here, through stories that we can understand something of truth? Or perhaps if our hearts are not open to that option, not see truth. What kind of things do you think are the most convincing if you were to meet a person today who was making big claims? Would you be convinced by their claims, by their lifestyle, by the sorts of stories and narratives that they were telling, or something else?
I suppose by their... Sorry, Dan.
Okay.
I suppose by their almost their actions sometimes, and what they do, and if they themselves are not just to preach something, but to kind of demonstrate what they preach. Well, I suppose, in Gospel of Luke, Jesus kind of does. He doesn't just speak about these things. He does help the poor and the weak and the ill. And I would find, if I saw that sort of thing happening, obviously you'd find it fairly compelling, but I don't know, just the words themselves, sometimes that requires, I suppose, an element of faith and belief in what they're saying. But in terms of being compelling, I think it's through actions that...
Yeah, I can only agree. I'm just trying to think of like stats. And just like, no, I just don't buy it. Like, you can throw graphs in my face and it's just like, I think you're conning me. And
Jesus works out MATLAB.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I think you're right. If you don't practice what you preach, it's just like, yeah, it doesn't even matter if you're technically right, because it's just like, yeah, I'm not going to follow you kind of vibe.
I'm going to disagree a little bit.
Sure.
But perhaps... Like, I don't necessarily think the miracles are necessarily particularly compelling, particularly in a modern day context, because I think there's probably always going to be a way where you could say, oh, but it could have been this scientific or whatever, explanation, and I think it would be difficult to be convinced. But if someone is preaching something philosophical that makes sense, I think you can still perhaps understand the ideas that Jesus would be trying to preach, and then perhaps take those forward and be, perhaps this is the way that I should lead my life.
I wonder if that's a really interesting thing as well, that different people from different cultures and different times and spaces might come to Jesus and require different types of proof. Like, I think what you've described there is, without wanting to pigeonhole you at all, probably quite a common thing for people living in the 21st century in the West who've got that sense of philosophy and I want things to be rational, and if it makes sense to me, if it chimes with me, I'm more likely to be convinced by it. And miracles don't exist in my frame of reference. And so if there's a miracle, I'm going to discount it because it's not something that I understand or register. Whereas someone who comes from a different culture perhaps would be less inclined to be convinced by arguments and philosophy, but the display of power in a miracle would be a lot more compelling to them. And I just think that's fascinating that within a very short time, we've unveiled that difference. And it would be interesting to look into how Jesus speaks to each of those different cultures and what's there for different people.
I mean, I think I disagree. I feel like it doesn't matter what culture you're in, you can ignore a miracle. It doesn't matter if you're like scientific or like there. It's not in Luke, but I just remember the story. Jesus feeds the 5,000. That's one of the stories that's in all four Gospels. And then he goes across the sea and a bunch of people follow him because it's just like more free food. And then he deliberately makes everyone feel really uncomfortable by talking about like eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And then because you find out later he's talking about communion, where it's just like, this is my body broken for you. And everyone, like all the disciples must be breathing a sigh of relief. But anyway, like he deliberately makes them uncomfortable. And then the people's like response is like, well, show us a sign then. And it's just like, you literally just saw him. He was healing you all day. You got all fed. And it's just like, as soon as like there was something that demanded something of you, you're like, oh, well, show me something then. And it's just like, if he drew a bunch of flowers from his sleeve or something like that, they still wouldn't follow him. It's like, I don't know, when James, you were talking about before, I really think that some people just won't believe even if you smack it in their face. Like the example I have from like the Bible would be like the Old Testament Israelites, like parting of the Red Sea and those really famous miracles. Like the next thing that it says happened is that the people just completely ignored God and started like rebelling. Like, oh, I wish we're back in Egypt. And so it's just like, if you're a person who's seen this kind of stuff, I don't think the Bible ever claims that makes you like faithful or like a person who loves God or a person who's willing to follow God. Do you get what I mean? I just don't see the two things as equal.
But then why is there such an emphasis then on miracle performing also in the Old Testament if it seems to not be convincing people? And I mean, perhaps thinking of God in too much of a personified sense. If his strategy is for people to live in the way that he intended because that's the way that they'll be most happy, surely he'd think perhaps we shouldn't be blindly performing miracles and spend more time trying to educate people. Because I think the reason why that people aren't convinced is because they immediately benefit from these miracles, but they're the encouragement that they are given to believe, and then the further education that they're given in some situations seems quite slim. So why would they? They just think, this is useful for me. I have now been saved. I'm going to go back and living my life, and that's not going to change.
It's a really interesting question of like, why would God do miracles? And
I was particularly thinking also for the woman who just touched him in the crowd during the podcast, and now she suddenly wasn't bleeding, but she was like, you have been saved, and then she just left. And that was kind of it, because she wasn't one of the people who joined in following him, was she? Or was she one of the
he just
people
said, daughter, your faith has healed you, go in peace, is what he says to her. So it's just like, then she goes.
Yeah, so understanding what it means to be saved and to live the Christian life isn't particularly clear from this section of Luke.
Yeah. I wonder if there are kind of other, possibly multiple reasons why Jesus might do a miracle, like healing this woman, or in the Old Testament when God displays his power in big ways, like the parting of the Red Sea, or there's a story where he brings water out of a rock in the desert. Are there other reasons, perhaps in addition to showing people who he is and trying to convince them to follow him, that he might do those things that you can think of?
I mean, if he is the Son of God, he is going to be inherently good and kind, so presumably he would just want to ease the suffering of people. So I understand if he did have that power, and also being a flawed human walking on Earth, he would probably want to do what he could to save people, especially the people he was meeting on the day-to-day. But so I wouldn't necessarily say that he shouldn't perform miracles at all. It was just more the following stages.
Follow-up is lacking.
About saying, like, why don't you come with me? Even, or that you can learn more about being happy and living a good life also in the world, in the life beyond. There just didn't seem to be any of that. And like, if this woman sinned again, would she be saved? Could she go to heaven? It's not clear.
I'd agree with that. Like, no, I don't know what happens to this woman after this. Yeah. The full story is in people like the disciples, who you do see, like, they hear Jesus teach, then he comes, he does do a miracle, he kind of proves what he's saying, and then he says, follow me, and then they follow him, and then they hear him teach. So it's just like, it's easier to see in that trajectory where you see someone who's just with Jesus from that point. But when Jesus says, just like, go in peace, like, you're cool. And it's just like, then they wander off. And it's not directly following Jesus in the same way, but it's like they still know God, because these aren't just random people, they're like Jewish people who know God. And it's just like, she came over just like, maybe Jesus is gonna be like that, just kind of trust that it's just like Jesus is who he says he is. She sneaks up behind him, gives him a poke, I'm healed, and then goes back living with God. It's like,
but is that trust, or is that when you've been suffering for many years of your life, you're willing to try every option?
I think maybe the last, yeah. But to be fair, even if Jesus would seem ridiculous, if you're really, really desperate, you could have a go.
Yeah, I mean, I would.
Yeah.
If I was that woman, I would give it a go.
Yeah, fair play. I have no idea about this woman. It's really hard, like, reading into this. Yeah.
In one of the other gospel accounts, this story is told as well, and I remember reading, it kind of documents the thought process of this woman and says, if only I could just touch his cloak, I'd be healed. And so that's what the woman is meant to have been saying or thinking to herself, and then she managed to touch his cloak and is healed. So maybe that gives us a slight insight, so not from Luke's account, but I can't remember which one it is, but that she had that, if only I could just touch it, then I know I'd be healed. So yeah, I think, but yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Seeing all these different responses to Jesus. Like you were picking up earlier, James, some people didn't believe in him, even right then and there when they'd seen all these things, and then others did after what seems like the smallest thing happened. It'd be really interesting to just hear what, for you all, as you've read or listened to this gospel, what do you think? What are your thoughts of Jesus?
That's a corker of a question. Yeah, so I mean, I'm still, my personal views, I'm kind of fairly undecided. I probably would class myself as agnostic, but then ironically I'm not really sure about that either. Yeah, I don't know, I still, through like reading about all these miracles and things that go on, you know, it sounds so impressive and crazy, but I think it's still, for me, all comes down to the belief, and I've been kind of trying to put into words this idea that, you know, it's reasonable that there would be cynics in those times. I personally think, just because, you know, I feel like humans are inherently cynical about certain things, and just to think that those people that maybe, as we were saying earlier, Jesus maybe could have been a bit more evangelical and maybe he would have persuaded a few more people. But say those people that he wasn't able to persuade, maybe he didn't necessarily try hard enough, I don't know. But all those people are potentially missing out on this promised, you know, heaven and eternal, I suppose, peace. And I just think that to me, it almost seems quite unfair that these people would miss out on something because of their, you know, how skeptical they might be about it. Like, I wonder what your thoughts are on that, on people that aren't potentially sure, and should they potentially miss out on this great thing? And is it fair that they miss out because they haven't decided?
I mean, if I can come back on you, I feel quite strongly that God isn't playing the game with humans where he just kind of stands behind the curtain, and then at the end of your life when he dies, he pops out from behind the curtain. It's like, surprise, you guessed wrong. Like, I really don't think, like, what I get is, like, consistently God's heart is to reach out for people, and he's not far from any one of us. And it's just like longing for us to, like, tentatively reach out for him because he's reaching out to us, particularly in Jesus. And so, like, when you're talking about, if Jesus tried harder with some people, like, firstly, I don't know.
I don't mean that Jesus didn't do enough. I don't mean that.
But I do get what you mean when you're saying, but surely if, like, someone's skeptical, like, couldn't, like, that gap be just bridged? And there are cases where that's, of course, the case. You'd know the story of Thomas, I'm sure, where he's like, I won't believe that Jesus is resurrected until I get to poke him myself. And then Jesus rocks up and is like, you can poke me if you want. And he's like, I don't think Thomas does. I think he's then just like, I'm really sorry. My Lord, my God, he confessed it. And that there's some people who do get that chance. And it's just like, particularly like the religious establishment, being like, Jesus is going around saying blasphemous things like, I'm God. Like, and so they do want to kill him, and so he invites people to follow him, but it's just like, no matter what he's done, they've seen his miracles, but they still won't follow him because, you know, they'd have to give up their own lives, their own status. So there is an extent where, if I do believe that since God wants relationship with everyone, if there's a little, like, bump you need to get over, that God's more than competent to reach over that bump. But I don't want to, like, mix it with people that just would never accept it no matter what. Kind of, I don't know. Joanna, you're making a face.
Yeah, because I think that's also kind of easy to say when we can read the Bible so many thousands of years later. And I'm going to say in a slightly impersonal way, because, you know, you aren't directly relating to everyone within the story, because it was a very long time ago in a very different context. And it's kind of easy to see from the teachings that it was like, oh, but he did reach out to some skeptics, so therefore if I'm a skeptic, if I change my mind, I can also be reached out to. But for the people that where they might have been more convinced, and he didn't reach out to them, thinking about them on, like, a personal level being there, then that is a real shame for them if they were real people. So I think it's difficult to see back then sometimes how far God was willing to go to try and build a relationship with people.
But, like, it's obviously a shame not to have met the physical Jesus when he's wandering about. But it's like, well, none of us believe that you have to meet Jesus as he's wandering about in order to have a relationship with God and be saved. So I feel like those people who missed their chance as Jesus was going from one town to the next, I don't think they missed their chance, if, as it were, if that's what you mean.
But surely you have to read the Bible to understand how God wants you to be, to help build a relationship with God. Like, if you couldn't necessarily just completely naively build a relationship.
How do you mean?
Well, because... Well, it's kind of like in as much that if you kind of be a believer as Christians, that the Bible is how tells us how God wanted us to live. Do you believe that anyone who was like willing to kind of seek out God before they knew about the Bible would reach all the conclusions made in the Bible in building that relationship? And would they always live in the right way?
This is a hard one for me to answer because I'm coming from a place where I really like knowing the answers in theological. And I find it so, I don't know, helpful, humbling, I don't know what the word. I keep on imagining like a medieval peasant. And it's just like, can they be a Christian? And I have to be like, yes, Dan, they can. And it's just like, it's never like you're saved by believing the correct theological information. Which also I just think helps so much with like unity with other Christians when we disagree about stuff. Because it's not like, again, there's like a quiz coming into heaven being like, well, were you wrong about this? Well, no. So like that medieval Christian is a good example of just like, they can't even read, let alone read the Bible. Like they believe in like witches and have all sorts of ideas being wrong. And it's God still loves them just as much as he loves me. And I don't think it matters if they've got like a slightly garbled impression of what God is. Because again, it's that thing about like, when you get to the end, he's not going to jump out of a curtain and say, haha, you got it wrong. It's just like, you just get this picture of a gracious God. And the Christians get so excited about the Bible because that's like, it's how I get to know Jesus better, by reading it. But I can't say that and then at the same time say that like, all these people who maybe Jesus walked past one day in the street and didn't have a chat with, like they're automatically damned because they haven't read the Bible. I don't know. Maybe I'm missing what you mean.
But then how can you know what it is to sin and what is a sin if you haven't even kind of got that basic understanding? Like, because I don't know, because I don't have a personal relationship with God, and like I don't understand quite the communication. Would God literally communicate to you about whether he thought something was wrong?
These are really great questions, and I don't know if we can answer these in this podcast, but really great questions. And there's like a whole book of the Bible dedicated to answering this called Romans, which talks about how it's a letter to a church in the early century, in the first century after Jesus had died. And basically these exact questions are being wrestled with of, well, if I don't have this law that's been given, am I like, if I don't know that it's wrong, can I be condemned? And how do I know without that? But also he talks about our consciences as a way of us knowing things that are right and wrong, and that being one way, and that there are lots of ways that God can communicate with people, one of them being through the word of God, the Bible. And I just love to talk about this more. Perhaps you guys can do a Bible study of Romans level 3. That'd be really fun.
Commission a new podcast series. I thought.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think there are two key questions here in what we've raised. One of which is, what is the Bible? And the other one is, what does it mean to be saved? And again, I don't think we have time to answer both of those right now. But
stay tuned, folks.
Yeah. I just thought it would be really helpful to direct us to one little passage in Luke. It's right at the end, so it's not in this episode. So I'm breaking the rules a little bit here. But so Jesus is on the cross, and there are two thieves. In fact, I think the word is better translated as they were rebels. They were people who were sort of, imagine the people in the Capitol building rioting against the president. They're that kind of character.
Wow.
They've been crucified.
Spicy topical reference.
Yeah, either side Jesus. And one of them's hurling insults at Jesus and saying, why don't you come down off the cross? What are you doing? Save yourself. Save us as well. And the other one says, actually, Jesus, I'm not righteous. I'm not innocent. Will you, you are innocent and I'm not. Will you remember me when you enter your kingdom? Basically saying, can you save me? And Jesus says, yes. he says, truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. And so that guy's probably never read the Bible. He doesn't have a fully formed understanding of what it means to relate to God. He just knows that Jesus is what he needs. And I wonder if that is something that might be helpful to us, that if you have thought that, like, I need your help, Jesus, that's your starting point. And then perhaps you go on from there, and then you read the Bible and you read about who God says he is throughout the whole of the Old Testament and the New Testament. But I just thought I'd bring that up since it's in Luke. And maybe we can kind of come into land a little bit here. Are there any final thoughts or questions that any of you would like to bring? Because I honestly would love to chat to you guys for hours, but we haven't probably got that long. So yeah, any more questions or responses to what I've just said?
I'm not doing anything these days. No, I'm joking. Let's have a think.
We didn't talk about how literally certain miracles taken. And particularly, I wanted to ask in the context of the demon exorcisms.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, this is the most demon-heavy part of the entire Bible, and I was wondering if you're going to ask about it at all.
And the demons just went into the pigs, and the pigs just drowned themselves. It's very bleak stuff.
The villagers not mad.
It's shocking.
So what's the question? Is the question
that's the question.
how literally do we take it?
If I say a couple of things and you can push back, and then we can try and be obedient and come into land.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Sounds great.
For literal, I feel like the easiest thing to do is kind of do it book by book, because I feel like you're just going to get yourself in a very weird place if you come to like a book of poetry and then just insist because, you have an opinion that the Bible is this. So it's just like, I'm very happy coming along to Luke being like, yep, this is just an account. I'm happy to take it at face value, because the most important bit for me is Jesus' death and resurrection. And I've done way too much like legwork on that kind of front of just like, can this really be trusted? And it's just like everything else, like, who cares? If Jesus did die and rise again, that's the thing that everything hangs on. And if he did, then he's the kind of person who has the power to do these things. So it's like, so just summary, like, Luke is in my historical kind of folder, and I don't particularly mind any miracles because I'm most sure about the most important one. So if there's just something that's, in character for Jesus, I don't really mind. For demons, like, there's a mix, particularly like, when Jesus comes down the mountain and there's this guy who have like epileptic fits. Like, sometimes I think it's like a diagnosis, but the one with the pigs, it's just like, that's just not a man with schizophrenia. There's like other things going on here. So it's a funny thing.
With Mary Magdalene, when they're like 7 demons, like, are they implying that she has 7 diagnosable mental illnesses?
Yeah, I thought that was very specific.
Yeah, I'm like, 7. Did they count? I have no idea. Like, or is Jesus does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 exorcisms in a row, and then that's how they tick it up. Like,
or was she embodiment of like all of the 7 sins, and so there were 7 demons that came out?
Nice, Jamila.
Well, then in a little bit of Bible trivia for you all that I learned the other day. In the Bible, the number 7 in Hebrew, it is the same Hebrew letters as the word for complete, and also the word for Sabbath rest. So, which is another concept altogether. But so often in the Bible, the number 7 is representing completeness and fullness.
Okay.
Wow.
And so it's actually crazy how many times the number 7 is used in the Bible. And if we think about it, we have still 7 days in a week. And
that's a complete week.
Yeah.
Wow. Very true, I know. Groundbreaking stuff on this podcast.
So perhaps saying the 7 spirits, I'm not saying that is this, but just one thing to throw in the ring might be that the number 7 there is saying there was it was fully cast out, perhaps.
Or kind of like how we'd say like a billion for loads. Like, we just mean loads. We don't mean we counted exactly a billion. But,
that is a bit of speculation. So I'm not saying that with any authority.
Perhaps that brings up another point that I wanted to make.
Go for it.
About the Bible and plot devices, because if you talk about things like 740, those symbolic numbers which are there to convey an argument rather than, let's say, this literally happened. And as I was listening to the podcast of Luke, it seemed like the disciples are often used as plot devices for Jesus to speak a parable, and then for it to be literally interpreted, for Jesus to literally explain it to the ununderstanding disciples in order for us to be able to understand. And I don't quite see how, but though if they literally just didn't understand, how that ties in with God giving them so much power to preach and perform miracles if they don't understand his word. Or does that tie in with the fact that although people might not understand the word of God, they might still trust God enough that they can, I don't know, do things by his name?
I genuinely think the disciples were mugs most of the time. Like, they were such mugs. There's a thing in, like, the episode where it's like James and John, it's just like, some Samaritans is like, no, go away, Jesus. And they're like, can we call down fire on heaven to destroy them all? And it's just like, Jesus tells them.
I was going to bring this up. I was like, chill out, James and John.
Yeah, it's just like, dude, it's like, they are such
Go
mugs.
back to the fishing boat.
Like, so much of it you can't make up. I'll give you this in, like, John. Like, so John's one of the disciples, like James and John here. And, you know, in his account of, like, the resurrection of Jesus, he explicitly talks about, like, Peter starts running and then John starts running and gets there first. And just, he puts this detail in his gospel that he's a faster runner than Peter for everyone to know. And it's just like, there's so much stuff that you just wouldn't make up just as a narrative device, like the Watson to a Holmes who knows everything and the Watson just is there to ask questions. It's just like... As early church leaders, I feel like they don't serve themselves by portraying themselves as such mugs as they are. Like,
no, that's probably true.
So I feel like they don't gain from that description. You can just, if you're doing that, it's just a person in the crowd, or like Judas would ask all the stupid questions, and then all the disciples would like have a better rep. I feel like, yeah.
But why don't they learn?
But it kind of makes sense afterwards. Like, a load of these bits is just, like, when Jesus was, say, talking about, like, dying, it's like, they didn't really get him, but they didn't ask him what he meant. But then when it happens, they're like, oh! And then it just, like, loads of this stuff just kind of clicks in their heads. Like,
I mean, I guess, but also going on while Jesus was trying to preach, and then the disciples with him, well, one, surely it would make sense that they should understand things better to go and preach to other people. Like, some of the parables outside of the death and the resurrection of Jesus, like, you can understand what he's talking about in isolation, and I don't really get why they don't understand any of that.
I think I'm not going to be that harsh on them. I think they get some of the easier parables, not gonna lie. I think they do understand some.
There's an interesting point there in terms of that. What is Jesus trying to do when he's telling these parables or when he's preaching? Is he trying to convince everyone beyond any doubt of a particular fact? Or is he saying things and giving people the opportunity to respond to them according to how they want to respond? I just found it, my eyes glanced at the top of one of the pages, and he says, actually, I think they asked him why he speaks in parables. And he says, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. So, they asked him what the parable meant. He says, the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to others I speak in parables so that though seeing they may not see, though hearing they may not understand. And there's that sense of, I'm telling a story, and if people have got if they're listening, they're going to pick up on the meaning that I'm giving them. But if their hearts are hardened, if their minds are closed, they're just going to hear a story. They're not going to hear the truth. And you're right. I think it's really interesting and funny that even though he does sometimes speak really plainly to the disciples, they clearly just don't get it.
But is that not a reflection that their hearts and minds aren't open if they don't understand according to what Jesus is saying? And then the people who are closest to him don't understand his word. So how can they hope for anyone else to be able to understand what he's saying?
Well, go back to that example from the parable of the seeds. It's almost just like he puts up the public face, and anyone who asks him, like the disciples go up to him afterwards, and anyone who asks him, he explains the meaning quite plainly. But that at least was being more of like, I don't know, like a shield from people trying to kill him for being a heretic. Yeah, I don't... There's a thing about God using weak people, though, quite consistently across the Bible. Like, he could have chosen a lot better people, frankly, or better qualified people. He just consistently doesn't. And I think the reason is just, like, it gives him more glory if he uses a weak person to do the same job when he could have used a strong person. Because if he uses a weak person, everyone's like, wow, God's so amazing working through that person. But if he just used, like, an incredible doctor, rather than just, like, a random fisherman who's been given the ability to heal people, like, then everyone would be like, whoa, that's a really cool doctor. I think it's, like, trying to put the emphasis back on him and back on God rather than on the people themselves. That's why he uses, like, such rubbish people most of the time. Including people like me. Woo.
You're not rubbish, Dan.
Yeah, that's Does that...
I guess it's just surprising that at this late stage in the Bible, you know, so close to Jesus' death. I mean, then perhaps that's because I haven't read the earlier passages of when they first started. Perhaps they were way worse. Not seeing that character development, and then it just suddenly clicks immediately after Jesus' death, when it is important for them to go and spread the word. It seems a little convenient in a way.
It would be really cool actually to read just to anyone listening as well, but for maybe as a little three, you guys can sit down and read, or individually, read the rest of the account of Luke. But then also, the account of Luke is not a standalone, because Luke, the doctor, this is just part 1. He wrote the book of Acts as well, which is part 2. And what we see is that right up to the very moment, including like the moment when Jesus arrested all his disciples who've been following him, as you said, for these 3 years, they've seen him do all these miracles. They've heard him saying all these things, explaining all of his teachings to them, and they scatter. They leave him. They abandon him. Even Peter, who is perhaps the closest disciple, they leave him and deny him, say they never knew him. And then, you're right, what an incredible change we see when we flick to the book of Acts. And a few chapters in, you see them giving incredible preachers, moving in power, they're healing people. It talks about even the shadow of Peter. His shadow was enough to heal people that he passed. What a difference that is. The same person is describing them, the same person is telling the narrative, but there's a change that's happened in them. And if you read Acts, you'll see what the moment is when that changes for them. But I think it's just a really wonderful thing to notice that all of you have picked up on, that it is the unlikely people, those who don't understand, those who are simple, those who are humble, that Jesus has chosen to associate with and reveal himself to. And we may have loads more questions about that, but that's probably quite an interesting thing for us to ponder as we finish, just to kind of leave on that. That is surprising. What do we make of that? But yeah, thank you all so much for chatting. I've honestly loved hearing all of your questions and thoughts. I feel like you've all brought so much insight, and I've learned about Luke's Gospel from this. So yeah, thanks so much. I hope you have really wonderful evenings.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much. Thanks for steering the ship.
No worries. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Luke Experiment podcast. To find out more and to listen to the rest of the series, head to storycambridge.uk, where there'll be a new episode released every 2 days.